I knew I was staying too long before I ever admitted it to myself. Not because the relationship was terrible. Not because there was some obvious reason to leave. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of knowing that shows up when you're brushing your teeth at night and you realize you haven't laughed in a while. When you look over at someone you love and feel like you're watching them from a distance you can't explain. When you start making small decisions as if you're alone, even though you aren't. I remember the first time I felt it clearly. I was standing in our kitchen, holding my phone, about to text her something I would have told her without thinking a year earlier. Something small. Something stupid. A coworker had said something funny, and I wanted to share it. I stared at the screen for a second, and instead of typing, I put the phone down. Not because I thought she wouldn't care. Because I wasn't sure she was still reachable in the way that mattered. I didn't call it anything at the time. I didn't label it as a warning. I just moved on. I made coffee. I went to work. I did what I always did. That's how it happened. Not with one moment. With 1,000 moments I didn't treat like they meant anything until they added up. Her name was Hannah. We met the way people meet when they're not looking for a story. It was late summer, warm enough that everyone wanted to be outside, and a friend of mine had invited me to a small get-together on a rooftop. I almost didn't go because I'd had a long week and my idea of recovery back then was quiet and isolation. But I went anyway. I told myself it would be good for me to be around people. There weren't many of us up there. Maybe 10. Someone had brought drinks. Someone had brought cheap snacks. Someone had brought a speaker playing music too low to matter. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was the kind of gathering that feels like a pause in life. Hannah was standing near the edge, looking out over the street. She had a drink in her hand, but she wasn't really drinking it. She looked like someone who wasn't trying to be noticed. I don't remember what made me walk over. I didn't think she was the love of my life. I didn't feel sparks. I didn't feel a dramatic pull. I just didn't want to stand alone in a corner pretending I was fine. So I said something. I asked what she was looking at. She glanced over, then back at the street, and said, "I'm trying to decide if the cars look peaceful from up here or if they just look small." It wasn't a flirt. It wasn't even a joke. It was just her. I laughed anyway because it felt honest. We talked like that for a while, loosely, about small things. About how weird it is to be in your late 20s and feel like you should know what you're doing by now. About how tiring it is to answer the question, "So what have you been up to?" when the real answer is trying to stay afloat. Nothing romantic happened that night. No kiss. No moment where time slowed down. When we left, she said it was nice talking to me. I said the same. We exchanged numbers in a practical way, like people do when they're not trying too hard. A day later, she texted me a picture of a street sign we had joked about on the walk down. A small thing. Just a continuation. I replied. She replied back. Then it turned into another message, and another. It was easy. That's what I remember most. Ease. We started seeing each other once or twice a week. Coffee after work. A drink on a Friday. Dinner on a random Tuesday because neither of us wanted to cook. The relationship didn't explode into our lives. It slid in. Hannah wasn't overly affectionate. She didn't do big gestures. She didn't talk in dramatic language. But she was consistent. She showed up when she said she would. She remembered little details. She listened. And that kind of steadiness did something to me. It made me feel safe in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I'd dated people who were exciting. People who felt like a storm. People who made everything intense and bright and unstable. I'd mistaken that intensity for depth. With Hannah, there was none of that. There was a quietness that felt mature, like something that could last. I told myself that was what love was supposed to be after you stopped believing in dramatic beginnings. We became official without having a formal conversation about it. We just started referring to each other as my girlfriend and my boyfriend naturally, like it didn't need to be announced. I met her friends. She met mine. Our lives began to overlap in small ways. We started having routines. Saturday mornings we'd go to the same diner. We'd split pancakes even though neither of us really wanted pancakes. We liked the act of sharing them. We'd walk around the neighborhood after and pretend we were being productive even though we were just killing time. At night, we'd sit on her couch. Sometimes we'd watch something. Sometimes we'd talk. Not in a heavy way, just about our days. About what we'd read. About things that made us laugh. I liked being around her. I liked the way she didn't make me perform. Even her silences felt comfortable at first, like I didn't have to fill them to keep her interested. When we finally moved in together, it felt like a continuation of that. It was about a year and a half in. We didn't have some huge conversation about taking the next step. We just kept spending nights together, and eventually it became impractical to keep two separate places. We were already splitting groceries, already leaving clothes at each other's apartments, already living out of the same spaces. So we found a place. A small two-bedroom apartment with old hardwood floors and a kitchen that felt too narrow if you tried to cook together. It wasn't special, but it was bright in the mornings. It had windows that made the living room feel open. It felt like something we could call ours. The first weeks were almost playful. We argued about where to put furniture. We went to a thrift store and bought mismatched lamps. We assembled a cheap bookshelf and laughed at how bad we were at following instructions. We learned each other's habits in a new way. Hannah liked to make coffee and then forget she made it and reheat it later. I left my shoes in the middle of the hallway like I'd never been taught otherwise. She folded towels a specific way. I didn't have a way. She liked the apartment neat. I liked it good enough. Those differences didn't feel dangerous then. They felt domestic, like evidence we were building a shared life. I remember one night early on, we were lying in bed and she rolled over and said, "I like living with you." It was a simple sentence, but it hit me hard because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a declaration. It was just honest. I said, "Me too." And for a while, that was true in the deepest way. I don't know exactly when it started shifting. That's what makes it hard to talk about. If there had been one big event, one clear turning point early on, I could point to it. I could say, that's when we started falling apart. But it wasn't like that. It was more like the slow dimming of a room. You don't notice it until you look up and realize you can't see as clearly anymore. The first thing I noticed was silence. Not the comfortable silence we used to have. A different one. The kind that shows up when you're both in the same room, but living separate evenings. Hannah started spending more time on her phone. Not hiding it. Not doing anything suspicious. Just absorbed. We'd sit on the couch after work and I'd start talking about something, and she would nod, but her eyes wouldn't leave the screen. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Everyone does that now. I did it too sometimes. We were tired. We worked all day. We were allowed to decompress. But then it started happening more. And when I tried to pull her back into a conversation, it felt like I was interrupting her. She started coming home later. Not dramatically late. Not like she was out all night. Just later than before. She'd say she stayed after work to talk to someone. Or that she grabbed a drink with coworkers. Or that traffic was bad. All reasonable things. But I noticed something. She didn't mention those plans ahead of time. Before, she would text me, "Hey, I'm grabbing a drink after work." Now, she'd walk in and say, "Oh, I went out with them." It was subtle, and it shouldn't have mattered. But it did, because it meant I wasn't part of her default thinking anymore. Dinner routines broke first. We used to cook together a couple nights a week. Not fancy meals, just simple things. Pasta, stir-fry, tacos. We'd stand shoulder to shoulder in the narrow kitchen, bumping into each other, laughing about how we never had enough space. Then it became her cooking while I worked late, or me cooking while she stayed out. Then it became us ordering takeout separately, each choosing something without consulting the other. We still ate at the same table sometimes, but it felt less like a shared ritual and more like coincidence. Weekends started changing too. We used to plan them, even loosely. Want to go to the farmer's market? Want to see that movie? Want to just walk somewhere? Now, weekends were a collection of separate errands that occasionally overlapped. She'd say, "I'm going to meet Sarah for coffee." I'd say, "Okay." I'd say, "I'm going to the gym." She'd say, "Okay." And by Sunday night, we'd be tired and quiet and vaguely dissatisfied, but nothing had technically gone wrong. That was the thing. Nothing was wrong enough to address. There was no betrayal, no screaming, no slammed doors, no obvious cruelty, just a gradual erosion. An erosion is hard to fight because it doesn't feel urgent until it's already deep. I started noticing the way she talked about her life in language that didn't include me. She didn't do it intentionally. She wasn't trying to exclude me. It was more like she forgot I was supposed to be part of the picture. "I'm thinking of taking a trip in the fall. I might apply for that position. I'm considering switching departments." She didn't say we. She said I. I told myself it was healthy. People should have individual lives. People should have autonomy. But autonomy doesn't have to erase partnership. And that was what it started to feel like. Like the partnership was disappearing. I asked her once if she was okay. Not accusingly. Just gently. She looked up from her phone and said, "Yeah. Why?" I didn't have an answer that sounded reasonable. Because how do you explain a feeling that isn't attached to an event? How do you say, I feel like I'm losing you, when she's still standing right there? So I said, no reason. Just checking. She smiled a small smile and went back to her phone. That should have been the moment I pushed. That should have been the moment I said more. But I didn't. I didn't want to create conflict out of something I couldn't prove. I didn't want to be wrong. I didn't want to be the insecure partner who makes a big deal out of nothing. So I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, I slowly started becoming someone else too. I began editing myself. I stopped bringing up certain topics because they felt inconvenient. I stopped telling her about my day in detail because she didn't ask for it. I stopped making plans and instead waited to see if she would. I started noticing how often I waited for her, not physically, but emotionally. I'd save something to tell her. A story, a thought, a small frustration. And then the moment would pass, and she wouldn't ask, and I'd let it go. Eventually, I stopped saving things. And that's when the real loneliness began. Because when you stop saving parts of yourself for someone, it's not just distance. It's detachment. We still said, I love you. But it started sounding like punctuation. Something you say at the end of a call. Something you say before sleep. Something you say when you leave the house. Automatic. Not false. But not present. Sex changed too. It didn't stop immediately. It just lost its texture. It became less curious. Less connected. More scheduled. More like something that fit into the week if there was time and energy. Afterward, we'd lie in bed facing opposite directions. I want to say something. Something that would bring us back. Something honest. But I didn't know how to start without making it a conversation about what was missing. And I was afraid of naming it. Because naming it would make it real. So I stayed quiet. The silence became normal. And that's how you stay longer than you should. Not by deciding to endure misery. By letting quiet disappointment become part of daily life until you don't know where it begins and ends. The turning point, the real one, didn't happen during a serious conversation. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays felt forgettable. No expectations. No plans. Just another day in the middle of the week. I came home early. I'd finished something at work and decided to surprise Hannah by making dinner. Nothing fancy. Just something warm. Something that said, I thought about you. I texted her, hey, I'm home early. Making dinner. She didn't respond. I didn't think much of it. She was probably busy. Or driving. Or in a meeting. I cooked anyway. I cleaned up while things simmered. I set the table. I even lit a candle and then felt slightly embarrassed about it and almost blew it out. Then I left it. She came home about an hour later than usual. She walked in, dropped her bag, and said, hey. Hey, I said. Dinner's almost ready. She nodded and went to wash her hands. When she came back, she glanced at the table. Oh, she said. You cooked? Yeah, I said. Thought we could eat together. She hesitated, just for a second. Just long enough that I noticed. I already ate, she said. I grabbed something with Sarah after work. I forgot to tell you. She said it like information. Not like something she regretted. Not like something she was apologizing for. Oh, I said. She sat down anyway, scrolling through her phone while I ate alone. She didn't ask how my day was. She didn't ask why I was home early. She didn't notice the candle. She wasn't being cruel. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She just didn't think about me. That was the moment. Not because she ate without me. Plans change. People eat with friends. Life happens. But because it didn't occur to her that I might matter in that equation. That I might have been part of the decision. That I might have been worth a text. I sat there chewing food I suddenly didn't want. The candle burned between us like a small, ridiculous symbol. Hannah laughed quietly at something on her phone, and something in my chest broke in a quiet, internal way. Not dramatically. No tears. Just a shift. I didn't say anything. What would I have said? You forgot about me? I made dinner, and you didn't care? I feel invisible. All of it sounded pathetic in my head. I didn't want to beg for importance. I didn't want to argue myself back into her attention. So I stayed quiet. That night, in bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt a kind of exhausted clarity settle over me. I was lonely, not in general, in my relationship, and I had been lonely for longer than I wanted to admit. After that Tuesday, I couldn't unsee it. I didn't realize how much being needed mattered to me until I wasn't needed anymore. And when I started trying to bring us back in small, ordinary ways, it felt like she was only meeting me halfway, polite, present, and already elsewhere. A few weeks after the dinner, we were sitting on the couch watching something neither of us was really paying attention to. She got a text and immediately sat up straighter. Sorry, she said. I need to respond to this. She turned away, typing quickly. I waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. She laughed quietly to herself. I looked at the pause screen and realized she had forgotten I was there. Not because she didn't care, but because I wasn't urgent. I stood up and went into the kitchen. She didn't notice. I leaned against the counter, staring at nothing, and felt the weight of everything settle more firmly. I wasn't the person she turned toward anymore. I was the person she existed around. There's a difference. And once you feel it, you can't pretend you don't. I started withdrawing too. Not as revenge. Not to punish her. It was self-protection. I stopped initiating plans. I stopped suggesting date nights. I stopped filling the silence with conversation. And the worst part was, she didn't notice. Or if she noticed, she didn't react. Which confirmed everything. We eventually had a conversation. Not the dramatic kind people expect. No yelling. No crying. Just quiet honesty that felt too late. It happened on a Sunday morning when we were both home, both slightly hungover from separate social things, both sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through our phones like strangers. Hannah looked up and said, "Do you feel like we've been kind of off?" My chest tightened. Not because I was surprised, because hearing it out loud made it real. Yeah, I said. She nodded slowly, like she was considering it. I don't know, she said. I feel like we've grown apart. I stared at the table. I feel like I stopped being important to you, I said. Hannah's eyebrows lifted slightly, like she hadn't expected that. That's not true, she said automatically. But then she paused, and she didn't say why it wasn't true. She didn't offer examples. She didn't reach for my hand. She didn't ask what made me feel that way. She just stared back at me with something like confusion. And in that confusion, I understood something that felt worse than anger. It genuinely hadn't occurred to her. She wasn't consciously choosing to hurt me. She just wasn't considering me the way she used to. We sat there for a long time. Eventually, Hannah said, "I don't want to fight." "I don't either," I said. And that was the problem. We were both so committed to not fighting that we had avoided every conversation that might have saved us earlier. We went back to our phones, because neither of us knew what to do next. After that, life continued. We didn't break up. We didn't fix it either. We just existed inside the truth we had finally spoken. It's strange how you can keep living with someone after realizing you're not really together. The apartment became quieter. Not in a peaceful way. In a careful way. We were polite to each other. We asked practical questions. Did you pay the bill? Do we need groceries? What time are you coming home? We stopped talking about feelings entirely. Like acknowledging them would make everything collapse faster. Some nights, Hannah would be sweet in small ways. She'd bring me a coffee without being asked. She'd ask if I wanted anything from the store. Those gestures confused me. They made me question myself. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe this is just adulthood. But then she'd go right back to being distant, right back to existing in a separate world. And I'd feel that same quiet ache. I began noticing my own habits. How I avoided going home sometimes. How I sat in my car in the parking lot after work, staring at the steering wheel, just to delay walking into the apartment. How I felt relieved when Hannah said she had plans and would be out late. How I felt sad immediately afterward for feeling relieved. I started realizing that staying had become something I did out of fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of failure. Fear of starting over in my 30s when so many people around me were getting married, buying houses, announcing pregnancies. Fear of explaining to friends and family that it didn't work. Fear of admitting I had invested years in something that had quietly died. None of those fears had anything to do with love, but they were strong enough to keep me there. That's what people don't talk about. They act like leaving is always a clean, brave decision. Sometimes leaving feels impossible not because you're trapped, but because your life is built around staying. So I stayed longer than I should have. Months. Maybe a year. Time blurred because the days were repetitive. Work. Home. Silence. Occasional small talk. Occasional forced intimacy. Occasional moments where we pretended. And in between, the low hum of dissatisfaction that never fully left. Every now and then, I'd have a burst of determination. I'd think, we need to fix this. We need to try. I'd suggest therapy once. Hannah said, maybe. And then it never happened. I'd suggest we do a date night. Hannah would say, sure. We'd go to dinner. We'd talk about safe topics. We'd come home, and nothing would change. It felt like trying to fix a house whose foundation had already shifted. You can repaint the walls. You can buy new furniture. but the structure is still unstable. At some point, I stopped expecting change. That's when it got truly bleak. Not because things got worse, because I stopped hoping. Hope is exhausting, but it's also what keeps you alive inside something that's fading. When hope goes, you become quiet in a new way. You become resigned. I started thinking about Hannah's future without me, and it didn't feel impossible. It felt likely. I started thinking about my own future, and I realized I had been planning around her absence without admitting it. I imagined moving to a different neighborhood. I imagined taking trips alone. I imagined new routines. And then I'd feel guilty, because imagining a life without her felt like betrayal, even though our relationship already felt empty. One night, Hannah came home late and slightly tipsy. Not drunk, just looser than usual. She sat next to me on the couch and rested her head on my shoulder. For a moment, my body reacted the way it always had. I felt warmth, familiarity, a surge of wanting. I wrapped an arm around her. She stayed there quietly. Then she sat up and said, "I think I'm going to go to bed." And that was it. No conversation, no connection, just a brief moment of closeness that evaporated as quickly as it appeared. I sat there staring at the dark TV screen and realized how cruel small moments can be when they don't lead to anything. They make you remember what you're missing. They remind you the person is still there physically, which makes their emotional absence sharper. I don't know exactly when the idea of leaving stopped feeling like something I could choose. It started feeling like something that would eventually happen to us, whether I initiated it or not. Like a slow-moving ending. I waited for Hannah to say something definitive. I waited for a moment that would justify leaving. A fight. A betrayal. A clear event. But life rarely gives you those clean exits. Most endings are ambiguous until they're already done. Hannah was the one who finally said it, but not in a dramatic way. It was a Thursday night. We were both in the kitchen, doing separate things. I was washing dishes. She was making tea. She said, casually, "I've been thinking about maybe staying with Sarah for a bit." I stopped washing. The water ran over my hands. "For a bit," I said. She shrugged. "I don't know. Just some space." I turned off the faucet slowly. My first instinct was relief. It came before sadness, before anger. Relief, like someone had finally opened a window in a room that had been stale for too long. I hated myself a little for feeling that, but it was honest. I nodded. "Okay," I said. Hannah looked at me like she expected me to argue, like she expected me to fight for us. When I didn't, her face softened slightly. "Are you sure?" she asked. I didn't know what to say, because what I wanted to say was, "I've been waiting for you to say this." Instead, I just nodded again. "Yeah," I said, "if that's what you need." That was the closest we came to a breakup conversation. She packed a bag the next day. Not everything, just enough for a week. She moved through the bedroom quietly, folding clothes, gathering toiletries, not making eye contact. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched. It felt unreal, not dramatic, just surreal, like watching someone perform a routine you didn't know you'd rehearsed. When she left, she hugged me. It was a familiar hug, comfortable, empty. Then she walked out the door. The apartment was silent in a new way. Not the tense, careful silence we had shared. A real silence. An actual absence. I expected to feel devastated. I expected to collapse. Instead, I felt strangely calm. I walked through the room slowly. I noticed how much space there was. How much of our apartment had been filled with her quiet presence, even when she wasn't emotionally present. I sat on the couch. I listened to nothing. And I realized I hadn't been alone in a long time. Not because Hannah had been there. Because I had been managing myself constantly. Monitoring my tone. Monitoring my needs. Shrinking my emotions to fit the space she had left for them. Now there was no one to shrink for. That felt like relief. And relief felt like guilt. Hannah stayed with Sarah for 2 weeks. Then 3. She came back once to pick up more clothes. We spoke like acquaintances. Polite. Careful. She said, "How have you been?" I said, "Fine." She said, "Work okay?" I said, "Yeah." She didn't ask about feelings. Neither did I. She was wearing a different coat than usual. I noticed that in the same quiet way you notice someone's haircut. Like evidence that life was continuing without you. When she left again, she didn't hug me. She just said, "I'll text you." She did. A few days later, she texted, "I think it's better if I stay here for now." I stared at the message. I could feel my own heartbeat in my throat. I typed, "Okay." Then I deleted it. Then I typed, "I understand." Then I deleted that too. Finally, I typed, "Yeah." That's probably best. She replied with a simple heart. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, because I didn't know what it meant anymore. Weeks passed. We discussed logistics through messages. Who would keep the apartment? Who would take what furniture? How to split things we had bought together. The conversations were surprisingly practical. Not cold, just efficient. We were two adults dismantling a life that had slowly stopped feeling like a life. The day she came to pick up the rest of her things, I took off work. I thought it would be harder if I wasn't there. I thought she deserved not to do it alone. Or maybe I just didn't want to feel like I was being erased in my own home. She arrived with her brother and a couple of boxes. They moved through the apartment quietly. Hannah avoided looking at me too long. We said a few things. I'll grab this. Do you want that? Sorry, I forgot this. At one point, she stood in the doorway of the living room and looked around. Her face softened for a second, like she was remembering something. Then she blinked and the expression disappeared. She turned back to packing. When the last box was carried out, she stood near the door awkwardly. I'm sorry, she said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It sounded like something she had been told she should say. I nodded. Me too, I said, because it felt like the only response that wouldn't create a scene. She hesitated, like she wanted to hug me, like she wasn't sure she was allowed. Then she didn't. She just opened the door. Take care, she said. You too, I said. And then she was gone. After she left, I didn't cry right away. I cleaned. Not because the apartment needed cleaning. Because moving my hands gave me something to do while my brain tried to catch up. I wiped counters that were already clean. I vacuumed the living room slowly. I washed dishes that didn't exist. Later, I sat on the floor in the bedroom where her side of the closet was empty. It looked larger than it used to. The emptiness wasn't just physical. It was emotional. Like the relationship had finally matched what it had been for a long time. Quiet. Vacant. I thought about the early days. The balcony conversation. The pancakes at the diner. The night she told me she liked living with me. Those memories didn't feel like lies. They felt real. But they also felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. Like we were different people then. Or maybe we were the same people, but life had worn us down in different ways. I kept thinking about the dinner I cooked, the candle, the casual I already ate. Not because it was the worst thing she ever did. Because it was the clearest. It was the moment my body understood something my mind kept denying. That I had become optional. That I was no longer included by default. That I was living beside someone instead of with them. I stayed longer than I should have. And now, sitting in a quiet apartment, I started wondering what I lost in that staying. Not just time. Not just money. Not just the relationship. I wondered what I did to myself in those months of shrinking. I wondered how many times I swallowed something I should have said. How many needs I dismissed. How many small resentments I turned inward. I didn't come out of that relationship feeling like a victim. I didn't come out feeling angry at her. I came out feeling tired. And a little ashamed. Because part of me knew I had participated in my own disappearance. I could have left earlier. Not easily, but I could have. I could have insisted on real conversations. I could have drawn lines. I could have chosen myself sooner. But I didn't. I chose the comfort of staying in something familiar, even when it was empty. That's the part people don't understand. From the outside, it seems simple. If you're unhappy, leave. But inside it, it doesn't feel like that. Inside it, you're constantly negotiating with your own hope. You're convincing yourself it will change. You're telling yourself it's not that bad. You're holding on to good moments like they're promises. And you don't realize you've built a life around that denial until you're already deep in it. A few months after Hannah left, I ran into her at a grocery store. I saw her from the end of an aisle. For a second, my body reacted before my brain did. My chest tightened. My hands went cold. She looked fine. Not happier. Not sadder. Just fine. She turned and saw me too. We both paused. There was a moment where we could have pretended not to. But we didn't. We walked toward each other slowly. Hey, she said. Hey, I said. We stood there like strangers who shared a history no one else could see. How are you? She asked. Good, I said automatically. She nodded. Good. She looked like she wanted to say more. Then she didn't. I should go, she said. Yeah, I said. Me too. She gave me a small smile. It wasn't cold. It wasn't warm. It was just polite. Then she turned her card and walked away. I stood there for a moment, staring at the shelves. I realized I didn't miss her in the dramatic way I thought I would. I missed the idea of us. I missed the beginning. I missed being chosen. But I didn't miss the quiet loneliness of the end. That realization didn't make me feel better. It just made me feel older. I went home and sat on my couch and listened to the silence again. Not as an absence this time. As a fact. Late at night, when everything is quiet, I sometimes think about Hannah. Not in the way people imagine. Not with longing. Not with anger. More like remembering a place I used to live. It mattered. It shaped me. But I don't belong there anymore. I don't replay our best moments. I replay the quiet ones. The nights we sat on the same couch and didn't speak. The way she looked at her phone more than she looked at me. The way I stopped reaching because I was tired of feeling like I was asking for too much. I replay the Tuesday dinner. The candle. The plate in front of me. Her voice saying, "I already ate," like it didn't mean anything. Because that moment didn't hurt. It explained everything. I stayed longer than I should have. Not because I was fighting for love. Not because I believed things would change. But because I was afraid of what silence would feel like alone. I didn't realize I was already living in silence. Just with another person in the room. Sometimes I wonder who I would have become if I had left earlier. Not in a dramatic way. Just in small ways. Would I have spoken more freely? Would I have trusted myself more? Would I have stopped shrinking sooner? I don't know. There's no version of the past I can go back to. There's only this one. Where I carry the quiet knowledge that I ignored myself. Where I understand that staying can be its own kind of loss. Where I know that love doesn't always end with a goodbye. Sometimes it ends with people slowly forgetting how to reach for each other. I stayed longer than I should have. And even now, I don't say that out loud. I just live with it. Quietly.